Hello, everyone, and good evening. Thank you all for joining us. We're going to jump into the session now. Thank you for waiting. A few more people might jump in on the webinar, so we'll just start slowly here. Oops. My name is Francesca Silva, and if you join us for the other webinars, Part A and Part B, I was at those as well with my colleagues from Western International. Today, I'm joined by my colleague, Fabiana Tepedino, and you'll hear from her a little later. But the topic of today's session is living in London and adjusting to life at Western. And so the agenda for today really includes the following, what you see on your screen. We'll talk about cultural adjustment briefly. And if you joined us for the last webinar, this part might be a little bit of a review, but it bears repeating because it really is important to normalize that experience of cultural adjustment. You're all new students here at Western anyways, and that affects how you adjust to life in Canada. So we'll kind of review cultural adjustment and what to expect. The middle section will be about Canadian culture and some things that you might have noticed, you may know already, but a lot that you may not know about the Canadian context and cultural norms. So hopefully that will be insightful and will help you adjust to new culture that you're in. The other thing we'll be covering is how to find community, both on campus and off campus. We'll talk a little bit about student life at Western and living in residence or living with others, even if you're not living in residence. And then we'll end off with some tips for taking care of your finances. And that will include things like SIN numbers or whether or not you should file Canadian income tax, things like that. So it'll be a bit of a mixed pot in terms of content today, but we hope that you find it all helpful. Just with note that you're welcome to use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to submit questions throughout the presentation. We'll try and get to them throughout the presentation and then at the end as well. So if you have any questions, don't be shy. Use the Q&A function and we'll address it either live in the webinar or via text. Okay, so without further ado, I'm going to pass it off to my colleague Fabiana to start us off on the cultural adjustment piece.
Thank you, Francesca. Good evening, everyone. My name is Fabiana Tepedino, and I'm one of your international student advisors. And so what we're going to talk about first is around cultural adjustment and what to expect. So moving to a new country can be a really life-changing experience. And so I really like this quote from one of our students who said, "When I was new to Canada, I was like a newborn, experiencing all these things for the first time. After 4 months, I learned to walk." I thought it would be easy for me to survive in a foreign country since I always relied on myself and was confident about my abilities, but I was wrong. I did everything with caution to prevent any embarrassing mistakes. Experiencing challenges and cultural adjustment stress is a normal part of that cross-cultural experience, and we are here to help you. So remember about this, and don't feel embarrassed to reach out if you are experiencing some of these things as you adjust to a new culture. So some of you may be aware of what's called the W curve of cultural adjustment. This is a way of kind of explaining the ups and downs of moving to a new culture and the different stages. Clearly, the adjustment process isn't so linear and straight. There will be many ups and downs, but it helps explain kind of that process from moving to a new culture and also experiencing that again when you go back home, whether it's for the holidays or after your time here in Canada. And knowing, I think, the different stages helps as far as being prepared for some of that emotion that will come attached to that, and being prepared for that and knowing what to do in those situations. So the first stage is actually, I'm going to go back a little bit. The first stage is that honeymoon period. It is that exciting time. Things are new, exciting. You're experiencing new things. So, for example, orientation, right? All of those fun things are happening, and you're having a good time. But then you might start to notice those differences, the differences between Canada and your culture. They might start to be a little bit irritating. You might start to feel frustrated. You might start to experience some troubles, right? So, for example, milk in a bag, right? What countries do that? You might not have the right jug, or it might spill all over the place. Little things that can be frustrating. Or maybe you're frustrated by the food. Maybe the food seems a bit bland and maybe it looks all beige to you. Maybe you come from a country where there's a lot of spices, or you eat a lot of tropical fruits. I know when I moved to Canada, I'm originally from Venezuela, I was used to eating a lot of tropical fruits. So I got a little bored of the apples, oranges, and bananas. And so those things start to become a little bit irritating. Maybe you don't know how to greet people. Do you greet them with a handshake? Do you give them a kiss on the cheek? Do you just wave goodbye? Do you give them a hug? And that can vary depending on the friendships that you form here in Canada and can be a little bit confusing. So, for example, for me in Venezuela, you greet everybody with a kiss. But here in Canada, a lot of the times you just greet with a wave hello, maybe a handshake, maybe a hug if you're really good friends. And then because Canada is so multicultural, if you're interacting with somebody from your home country, you might greet them the same way that you would greet them back home, or you might greet them the same way that you greet somebody here in Canada. So sometimes there's a little bit of that dance of like, how do I greet you today? And know that those things are normal. Winter comes, and it's going to be cold, and sometimes that can be a little bit frustrating as well. And then you kind of might go a little bit deeper. You might feel homesick, depressed, or helpless. And it's important to know that these feelings are normal. I find that many students start to experience this around Thanksgiving that's coming up, right? So your midterms are coming, the days are getting shorter. You've been here for a little while now. It starts to get a little bit colder. And so everything I feel comes all at the same time. And that's when I feel that students are experiencing more of that culture shock. But what's important to know is that everybody gets through these stages at different times and at different speeds. So some of you might already be experiencing this. Some of you that are here for a shorter time might not experience these until closer to the end. So it just kind of depends. But knowing that this is an important part of that process. And so really important to let yourself feel those things. The allowing yourself to feel that allows you to kind of get through that a little bit faster actually than trying to avoid it. And then you start to adjust. You start to recover and you start to work your way through that culture shock and begin to adapt to the new culture. And so I want you to take some time during your journey here and write about or just kind of think about what are some of those differences between the Canadian culture and your home culture. What are some of those similarities, right? What are some of those lessons that you can learn? And think about what are those values that are important to you. But it does get better, right? You start to see Canada as your new home. You start to experience the Canadian culture. So maybe for Halloween, you might experiencing pumpkin carving. You explore the city. You have fun in the snow. The spring will eventually come, right? So things start to look up eventually. And so, as international students, there's a lot of different things that you experience, especially in your first term here, right? You might be experiencing a language barrier where this might be your first time having to think and speak in a different language 24 hours a day, right? That can take a lot of a big mental toll. You have the academic pressures. Maybe you are having difficulty navigating the campus and the city and figuring out where are those things that you need? Trying to find maybe food that's familiar or that's from back home or culturally appropriate foods, learning about your housing rights and responsibilities, learning to manage school and life here in Canada, how to access healthcare, what are those new rules and expectations, immigration concerns, and so much more, right? There's a lot of things that come with being an international student and a lot of different concerns that you may be facing already or you might face later on during your time here at Western. But again, know that this is normal, right? Many of our international students face these different cultural adjustment stresses. And so, some possible reactions when you're dealing with that cultural adjustment is that you might feel strain due to the effort that you need to make those necessary adaptations to a new and unfamiliar environment, right? It's exhausting to think in a different way, to learn new rules, in addition to keeping up with all of your academics and meeting new people. You might feel a sense of loss. You might be really missing your friends, your family support systems, maybe your status or your profession, for those of you that were working back home, and just your belongings, right? Everything is new. You just don't have that comfort around you and that network of people around you. You might feel rejection by the Canadian culture, or you might be rejecting the new culture as well. You might feel confused about what are your roles or your role expectations, the values between your core values and the values here in Canada. You might be confused about maybe some of the feelings you're having or your own identity. You might feel some surprise or anxiety or even disgust and indignation after becoming aware of some of those cultural differences. Maybe you might not be expecting some of those differences here in Canada. And so you might have some of those feelings come up. And you might have some of those feelings of incompetence due to not being able to cope in an unfamiliar situation. So thinking back to that initial quote of a student saying they felt like a newborn, right? They felt like you came in thinking, I know how to do these things. And then you get here and you feel like you can't figure out how to do things or where things are. And so you might feel a bit of that incompetence. And so, some possible signs for that cognitive dissonance is that you might feel disoriented and lonely. Again, you might feel homesick, sad, or depressed. You might feel very irritable, have lots of mood swings, or maybe you're crying often. Maybe you have a lot of stomach issues and headaches more than what you're used to having normally. You might start to use excessive use of alcohol and drugs. You might be stereotyping the local culture. Your sleep and eating habits may change. You're having difficulties concentrating. Maybe you're really bored and you start to withdraw. And so it's really important to be aware of those signs so that you can then deal with and know why you're feeling this way, right? And so some of the ways and strategies to cope with that cultural adjustment stress is, first of all, understand that it's a process and that you're not alone, right? Everybody has to go through these stages, but know that you are not alone. There's other students going through it, and you have staff and students here that are able to help you go through that process. Really important that you are eating healthy foods. So for those of you that are having stomach problems, sometimes you tend to stick to a diet that's more bland to try and digest those foods, but really important making sure that you are getting some of those fruits and vegetables into your diet. As here in Canada, they say to eat the rainbow when you're eating your meals, right? Making sure it's colorful. Making sure that you get enough sleep. Might be difficult for those of you that are in residence. Sometimes students stay up really late, or maybe you're staying up really late to be able to talk to your family, but making sure that you are getting enough hours of sleep in the day is really important in order to have those coping strategies. Also really important to exercise and spend time in the sun. Even just going for a walk, and Western is a beautiful campus with different walking trails. So getting out and either going for a walk or going to the gym, maybe invite a friend and go to the gym together or play basketball together. And right now, especially as the sun is out, spend as much time out in the sun as you can. And in the winter, when the sun is out, make sure to go outside or sit by a window. Get and stay connected. Community is so important to help you with this, with dealing with this cultural adjustment stress. So this means not only connecting with your family and friends back home, but also making those connections here in Canada, whether it's joining clubs, talking to your classmates or your lab mates, finding different ways to connect with others and seek support when you need it. Here in Canada, we look at asking for help as a strength, not as a weakness. So don't be afraid to ask for help, whether it's to your international student advisors or your peer guides, your professors, your classmates. People are here to help you and to support you. Making sure that you are connecting with your spiritual and cultural communities at Western and in London is also important. So while we say it's really important to learn about the Canadian culture and to connect with the Canadian community, it's also important to have that connection to your spiritual and cultural community because that's who you are. And so making sure that you remember your own culture as well throughout this time here at Western and share your experiences with others. Talk to other students, talk to other international students, talk to your roommates, to your families. Some students will do some vlogs and do some videos online as well. But the more you can share those experiences with others, the easier it will be. And remember to be patient with yourself and with others. It is a process, it takes time. It takes time to make friends. It takes time to adjust and just to get used to the different environments. And adopt a growth mindset, which we'll talk a little bit in a moment, and making sure that you are connecting and learning about the Canadian culture. And so when we talk about a growth mindset, sometimes we get stuck in this fixed mindset, right? Where we think about, I stick to what I know, I'm either good at it or I'm not, I avoid challenges, failure is a limit of my abilities, I give up easily. That's what we call a fixed mindset. But it's really important actually to have a growth mindset where we change those thoughts a little bit where we say, hey, I like to try new things, or I can learn to do what I want. Failures offer us opportunity for growth and learning. My intelligence can be developed. I learn from feedback. I keep trying and never give up. I'm inspired by others' successes. So making sure that we're having a bit of that mindset as we are going through these challenges will help us from not feeling stuck and being able to move forward and keep growing during this experience. So I'm going to now pass it on to my colleague Francesca to talk a little bit about Canadian culture and the basics.
Awesome. Thanks, Fabiana. So as we had mentioned, growth mindset super important, and then getting to know the Canadian culture and context. So that's where we're going to go next. Before we go there, you'll see a poll just has popped up on your screen. If you could take a minute to let us know who you are, undergraduate, graduate, or exchange students. We're just curious who is attending the webinars. We'll leave it up for as long as it's needed as we carry on. But thank you for responding to the poll question. All right, so as Fabiana mentioned, sometimes we can get stuck in this fixed mindset of like, I'm never going to adjust here to life in Canada, maybe like it's just too different. And what we really want to encourage you today is to kind of shift that mindset to a mindset more of curiosity. So we're going to give you some inside scoops about the Canadian culture and context. Hopefully it's useful to you, but if there's anything that we don't cover today and that comes up as you adjust to life here in Canada, what I don't want to forget to tell you is that the door is always open. to ask questions of our staff at Western International, our international student advisors. Perhaps you have a peer guide or are participating in the English conversation program. Those are all good touch points if you have any questions about, something that is giving you pause, a thing, something that you've noticed or is feeling kind of a point of confusion for you, right? So I don't want to forget to mention that. So we'll start with that. All right. And here we go. So a bit about the Canadian context. You'll know it's a big country, and the context matters because we have a lot of space and we use it. So you might have noticed a little phenomenon, perhaps when you're riding the bus, when you're selecting your seat in class or at the library, or even when you're lining up, um, that people leave space if they can. So obviously there are some context, full classrooms or crowded areas where people have no choice but to get closer together. But if Canadians have the opportunity to have some space between them and the next person, they will do that. If you ask them about it, they probably won't know why they even do it, but just a norm. We are just used to having a little bit of extra space. If you're coming from a place, for example, where it's much more populated in Canada, you're probably more comfortable being in closer proximity to other people, and you might be wondering, why is that person standing so far away from me, or why don't they want to sit next to me on the bus? Why do they prefer to stand instead of take the seat next to me? It's nothing about you. It's just a thing that we do. Also, from an early age, Canadian children are taught really don't talk to strangers. So sometimes that can kind of extend into adulthood, and we're just used to kind of keeping to ourselves, especially in public places. So if you're come from a cultural context where, everybody's really warm and friendly, and even if you don't know a person, you'll, easily strike up a conversation on the street or in the supermarket. Um, Typically, it doesn't happen as often in Canada, because people are kind of, um are individualistic in that way, and again, it comes from childhood, so that idea of don't talk to strangers for your safety, and then some people just don't let that go into adulthood and keep kind of to themselves. So they're, again, it's not about you, and it's not about, not necessarily being friendly, it's just, again, a norm. Um, Canadians also, unlike people from other countries, for example, Europe comes to mind, um, may not have lived or traveled abroad quite as much, um, comparatively. So, for example, many Europeans are used to, from a young age, traveling to different countries within the EU, because it's just so easy, and the proximity and the cost and everything else. So again, context matters. It's a big country. And we kind of have everything we need here. It's the cost of living is a bit high perhaps. And so it could be the case that you meet Canadians who have never, boarded a plane, or who have traveled internationally or live somewhere else, and that might not be what you're used to. So have patience, is the is the point here, but also, on the flip side, even though many Canadians haven't lived or traveled abroad ourselves, most Canadians are very used to meeting newcomers, interacting with people of different cultures and backgrounds within their workplaces, schools. So I mention this because many international students, perhaps if English is not your first language, you might feel self-conscious about accents and things like that. But don't. Most Canadians are very, very used to that. In general, most Canadians drive instead of walk, and you might be wondering why I'm pointing this out. Um, I point this out bec because we drive instead of walk generally, um, things are more spread out, um, depending on the city, for sure. In general, this front porch culture, it doesn't exist. So again, you might be used to in your home country or in your city where you come from that everybody knows everybody on the street. Everybody knows who's related to the next person or who lives two doors down. There's kind of an open door policy among neighbors and friends, and it's just more familiar. But because we drive so much, it's not uncommon um, for Canadians not to know some of their neighbors or many of their neighbors. Um, and we're kind of keeping to ourselves in that way. And so, um, again, it's not because of not being friendly or willing or interested in other people. It's just, again, a contextual thing. Um, I also like to always flag this for our new students because it comes up every year as a question or as a almost a worry sometimes with international students. They meet people in class or meet a new friend, and then, inevitably a few weeks later, they come to find out that that friend had a party and didn't invite them. And they're thinking, you might be thinking, why didn't I get invited? I met that person, made friends with them. Why didn't they invite me to the party? And you end up seeing perhaps pictures on social media or hearing about it, and you're wondering why that is. And why that is because here in Canada, it's very common for people to have different circles of friends. And what I mean by that is friends in different contexts. So work friends, school friends, friends that you play sports with, um, that kind of thing. So if perhaps somebody that you met, you fall into their school friend group, but maybe they had a gathering with friends that they play soccer with, or they had a gathering with friends, childhood friends that all know each other or have something else in common. And so it's not uncommon for people to have these different circles of friends and for those circles of friends to never meet or to meet infrequently. So maybe once a year there's a big party and everyone's invited, but most often, those groups are meeting in at different times in different places. Again, so not about you, it's just a context thing. In terms of important Canadian values, definitely equality, politeness, diplomacy, important Canadian value. There's a stereotype about um, Canadians being almost too polite in the sense of, apologizing for things that we shouldn't be apologizing for, not engaging in passionate debate most often, because we have this sort of politeness as a value. I mentioned individualism and personal space. Also, privacy is an important Canadian value. We'll talk about that in a minute. So, there are certain topics or certain areas of one's life that are considered too private, even for a discussion among friends. So, we'll talk about that in a minute. Fabiana also mentioned there's a culture of seeking help. So, you know, it's not frowned upon here in Canada for somebody to say, I need help with whatever it may be. And so help seeking, as Fabienne mentioned, is a sign of strength and not weakness. So important for you to know. And so when you continue to hear about all the supports and services that are available to you at Western, um, it's part of that important Canadian value. Direct communication is one also important Canadian value. People are, in general, saying what they mean and meaning what they say. But Along with that, because we have this drive to direct communication, but also have a value of politeness, what that can look like is this sandwich model of criticism. So um, I'll explain that. So oftentimes, when Canadians want to provide feedback or a critique of you or something that you've done, they'll often sandwich it between two very polite or positive comments. So you'll start out with, I really love that you do X, Y, and Z, but, and then their criticism is in the middle. And then they'll end off with, but, everybody has, different tastes or different things that they like. And so there's always a positive comment, maybe a little bit of a negative comment or the direct feedback, and then something positive at the end. So watch out for that. Listen for that if you're interacting with Canadians. To privacy. So, in some countries, perhaps where you're from, people enjoy being with others all the time. Group closeness, social interaction are highly valued. Yeah, again, you might be used to more of an open door policy. People can just show up at your house unannounced, and that's completely normal. But because of our um, Canadian values and norms, many Canadians really like to spend time alone daily. So having, they might say, I need to have a space or I need to have me time or whatever they want to call it, and to have scheduled time for friends. Emphasis on the scheduled time. So people often prefer to be told in advance if you want to visit or go out and make plans. They can get uncomfortable, perhaps, that if just show up and say, let's go out right now. Again, these are all generalizations. If you live in residence, you might be scratching your head and thinking like, "Oh, no, everybody's in everybody's space all the time in the resident situation." And that's a culture kind of on its own, if you're living a residence, but these are more general, Canadian norms. As I mentioned, certain topics of conversation are off limits, and we'll get to that, in a few slides. I mentioned people like direct communication. So, especially when confronted with a problem, um, Canadians typically like to approach it directly, speak directly with the hope of resolving issues as soon as possible. So, again, if they're not interested in, if you're not um, used to that, then you might be put off and think it comes off as maybe too direct or aggressive. So, definitely, just know that it's a norm here. You're likely to find Canadians to be open and interested in you and your country. Again, going back to even though we haven't traveled, or perhaps because we haven't traveled as much as others, we're really curious about the world. And so use that as a good starting point for conversation. You'll find that the more you share about your home country and your culture, or perhaps the places that you visited, um, you can have really interesting conversations. It could spark a lot of, back and forth questioning. So definitely use that to your advantage. Humor and sarcasm are an integral part of Canadian English, and that can be one of the hardest parts if English isn't your first language, or perhaps you haven't been in Canada for very long. So some of the, references, pop culture references made in jokes, or sometimes it can be hard to pick up on sarcasm if, again, that's not something you're used to. We always recommend practice. Practice really is the only solution to helping you become more comfortable um, in terms of conversational English. And so we have our ECP program, our English conversation program, that we recommend that students participate in. It's free. It goes for 8 weeks, and all of the leaders really have this in mind to help you become more comfortable in conversational English. Similarly, Canadians use a lot of slang or in short forms. I'm sure you've noticed this on campus already, um, with the acronyms for every single building on campus, the UCC or the UC or, IGAB or, whatever it is on campus. We love to use slang in short forms in our speech. But again, the recommendation, if you don't understand something, simply ask. People are very friendly. And I mentioned the English conversation program. Okay. The next section is kind of on social etiquette in Canada, some tips and some things that you might want to know. So, what does it mean to have good manners in Canada? What are the norms and expectations? So, in terms of perceptions of time, um, you may laugh when I say, my husband always accuses me of running on Latin time. So my mom comes from Ecuador, and he always says that because of that, I run on Latin time. I'm not looking at the clock. I'm just showing up whenever I want, late oftentimes. Um, but what are the norms here in Canada? So when is it okay to be late and when should I be on time? So in general, if you're going to a social situation, a party that, starts at 7 p.m., it's okay to be late, right? Because it's so social, s- a social situation. There's not necessarily a meal being served. But if there is a meal being served, dinner as at 7, that's a different story. So if there's a scheduled program for the event, there's a meal, there's a show, there's a movie starting, of course, um, things like that. If there's something happening at a specified time, you should be on time or actually 5 to 10 minutes early. Okay. In terms of levels of formality, again, depending on where you come from, um, or how you were raised, things like, calling an elder by their first name might feel a little bit awkward. I know growing up, my parents being immigrants to Canada, they always taught me, if anybody is older than you, they're Mr. or Mrs. or Doctor or whatever title, and their last name only. You didn't go to school with them. You don't call them by a first name, and that those were their cultural norms. But growing up in Canada, it was always awkward for me because I would go to a Canadian friend's house and I would say, "Oh, hi, Miss Smith. Thanks for having me over." And my friend's mom would be like, "No, call me Karen." And it was always awkward for me because I was raised differently. And so you might find this. Um, you might be used to addressing people more formally or more informally. In Canada, it's a bit of a mixed bag and it's really person dependent. So we always recommend you take your cues from the person. To be safe, you can start out more formally, "Hi, Dr. Johnson," or "Hi, Mrs. Smith." And if they tell you, "Oh, no, just call me Jane," they mean that. So going back to that direct communication, they're not going to tell you, "Oh, just call me Jane," and you're like thinking, "But do they really want me to call them Jane?" They do, right? So take the cue from the person. In terms of reciprocity and obligation, so again, depending on where you're coming from, there could be different norms around this. But for example, if you go to dinner or go to drinks with a friend, it could be you might be thinking, I'm the a male or the oldest person, and so I should pay for everybody. Or or on the other hand, everybody should pay for themselves. In Canada, again, it's a bit of a mixed bag, but in general, um, if somebody buys for somebody else one time, for example, I buy Fabiana a coffee today, there's kind of a written rule that at some other point in the future, maybe Fabiana would, buy me a coffee in exchange. So, um, that kind of loose returning of favors. In terms of splitting the bill, you'll notice, especially as students, it's very, very normal for each person to pay their own. It doesn't matter if there's somebody older or of a different gender. Everybody pays their own, and that's in general the norm here. I also want to touch on saying no. So again, depending where you're coming from, if you get an invitation, maybe the expectation or the norm in your culture is that it would be rude to say no or to decline any invitation. In Canada, that's not the case. So it's very, very normal and definitely a norm to say no if you're just not feeling like accepting that invitation or if it doesn't work for you. And so if that happens to you, if you invite a friend for coffee or dinner, and they say, no, actually, not this time or another time, don't take that too personally. Again, very normal here to say no. In terms of dining rules, again, you should be on time if somebody is inviting you for dinner, whether that be at their house or a restaurant. But if they invite you to their house, and you're having dinner with somebody who's preparing food for you, or even if you order at restaurant and you're both getting food served to you, in general, it's a norm to wait for the other person, wait for everybody have their food, wait for the host to sit down, um, so that everybody can begin eating at the same time. Again, it might be more casual in the residence or student situations, but again, we're talking in general terms here. You could bring a gift. You might think of bringing a gift, a bottle of wine, a dessert or something, especially if somebody is making food for you. You always want to compliment the chef, and then make sure you're putting away your phone, as a sign of respect, and appreciation for their time. So definitely, put that phone away. We talked a little bit about personal space and physical contact, earlier. Because we have space, we like to use it, and so with that goes, Canadians like to stand about an arm's length apart or more if there's more space. Um, so you'll find that, maybe when you're waiting in line, you're thinking, "Why is that person not moving up a bit? There's space." It's just because we're used to taking up that space. Um, and again, also that comes with physical contact. So maybe you're a person in your culture back home, um, it you're used to really talking a lot with your hands. I mentioned my mom is from Ecuador, but my other half, my dad, was born in Italy, and again, my husband says because of that, I talk a lot with my hands and end up, patting a back or slapping an arm or something. But you'll see if you notice, in general, Canadians don't have a little lot of physical touch during conversations. In terms of eye contact, Canadians like to make eye contact. It's a show of respect and attention to the other person, but make sure that you're not going too far staring, so, eye contact without blinking is considered rude and really can make others uncomfortable. This can be a hard one, depending on your cultural background and what you're used to, so it can take some getting used to and navigating, what you're comfortable with at, versus what the cultural expectations are here. Takes time, as Fabiana said. Greetings. Fabiana mentioned this too. Generally, we prefer verbal greetings, waving hello, shaking hands, hugs, kisses, usually reserved for close friends, partners, and family members. But you always want to follow the other person's lead, especially as you're getting to know new people here. As Fabiana mentioned, I'm talking about general Canadian norms, but because it's such a multicultural country, and you're going to meet people who perhaps immigrated to Canada, perhaps have, like me, immigrant parents and were raised differently. There's a lot of variation in some of these cultural norms. This one's a fun one. If you haven't noticed yet, how are you is actually not a real question. And what I mean by that, if you think back, all the times that you've been asked, how are you, since you arrived at Western, um, hopefully you've noticed that it's more of a greeting than a real question. So, hey, how are you? The expected answer is, oh, hey, I'm good. What are you up to? Or then you carry on with the conversation. The expected answer is I'm good or I'm fine. So I always challenge our new students because I think it's a little bit of a funny social experiment to catch Canadians off guard when they say, "How are you?" Maybe actually tell them how you are. If you do this social experiment and say, "Actually, I'm having a terrible day," they would be probably really surprised and caught off guard because they're so used to that standard answer of, "I'm fine," and carrying on with the conversation. So just keep that in mind. Notice it if you haven't noticed it in their conversations and your daily interactions. So, how do you start conversations? If you're feeling a little bit intimidated, it's new culture, new context. If you're feeling a little bit intimidated, your best friend will be small talk, right? So, pleasant conversation about general topics. Canadians love small talk. So, what is small talk? Um, One example, Canadians love to talk about the weather. So, always a safe topic. Um, it's cold outside, hey? Or it's a beautiful day. Or, it's really warm for middle of September. Um, those are all small talk types of things to start conversations. So, why is small talk useful? It helps break the ice or overcome that awkward silence. And when you're meeting people in a new place, it allows you to show your personality or what you're interested in. It's useful for finding out about common interests. So, for example, it's a beautiful day outside, would be great for soccer. And then the other person might say, "Oh yeah, you play soccer too?" Um, Me too, and I agree, or whatever, right? Uh, Key networking skill, you'll use small talk both in academic, career, or personal situations. And obviously, the whole point of small talk is that it can lead to deeper conversations and deeper relationships. So, small talk's do's and don'ts. So, I alluded to a couple times earlier in the presentation, there are some topics that Canadians feel are more private in nature, and so they're considered taboo, for example, so they would be something that you don't talk about. So, um, there's non-taboo subject and taboo subject. So, think of the non-taboo subjects as safe. Sports, hobbies, weather, like I said, family in general, so not getting into all the specific details of a person's family, but, do you have any brothers or sisters? That generally is fine. Where is your hometown? Where are you from? fashion, celebrities, favorite foods, recent movies, music, what do you are all safe introductory topics. Some more taboo subjects that you might reserve for very, very close friends once you get to know people, or even never, are that, lists on the right hand side. Typically, Canadians do not talk about, salary, how much a person makes, um, or aspires to make, how much their spouse makes, how much money their family has, all those things. Politics, we do talk about politics, but not in the way that many other cultures, engage with politics. Again, that cultural value on, everybody's entitled to their own opinion. So we're not necessarily engaging in those passionate debates to sway a person to think one way or the other. We're not really talking about intimate relationships or what people do in those intimate relationships. Religion could be a taboo subject. If it's coming from a place of curiosity, then it might be non-taboo. But in general, we don't get too far into, why people believe what they believe or why they do what they do. Death, finances, course grades is another one. You'll find if obviously you've noticed already in at Western, your grades are not posted publicly for everybody to see. It's a private matter. You can see your grades. Your, professor knows your grades, of course, but your classmates will never know grades unless you tell them. And so if you ask a classmate, how did you do an exam? They'll probably say, I did well, or I didn't do as well as I had hoped, but they probably won't give you um, a number and, a percentage that I got an 89% or I got an A or B. They probably won't share that with you. Same thing in terms of family planning, do you want kids? Why don't you have kids? People stay away from that topic because we don't know the situation. They're a personal matter for perhaps it's something, um, medical, why people don't have kids or a personal decision. So we really are not talking about that. And then other private matters. So if you're ever curious or unsure about whether a subject maybe falls in the left or the right category, again, definitely ask, right? So I'm going to get into some tips on the next slide. So if you find yourself perhaps asking or bringing up a topic and you read the other person's body language or facial expression, you've made them uncomfortable. You can just apologize and explain, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to be too personal. In France, we talk about finances openly. Please don't feel like you need to answer my question. Easy to kind of rewind that conversation. You can also ask for more information. So I'm curious, if here in Canada, people don't like to talk about X, Y, or Z. I've noticed. Can you tell me more about that? Truthfully, Canadians probably won't have great answers to these questions. It's just like we don't, it's a thing that we don't do, right? But it could lead to interesting conversation. And importantly, be able to laugh at yourself. Don't take mistakes too seriously. As long as you apologize, move on, learn from it, people won't generally be angry with you. You can just view that situation as a funny cultural oops moment and learn from it. A little bit about relationships norms now before we end off this section. Um, You probably have noticed in Canada, it's common for men and women to be friends, just friends. I know in certain cultures, men and women perhaps are friends, but it's like always leading to somewhere else, to dating or marriage. Here, very common for men and women just to be friends. friends could be for years, and with no romantic expectations. Also, romantic relationships can take many forms. You'll have noticed, you know, in Canada, there's a wide variety of sexual preferences, gender identities, and all are accepted and valued. So that might be the same or different from your home culture, but be aware that here in Canada, the expectation is that we're all accepting and valuing each and every individual. So you'll notice perhaps on um, email exchanges that you have with your professors or staff that everybody is including nowadays, or most people are including their preferred pronouns. So making sure that you're addressing people with their preferred pronouns. So she, her, him, they, whatever that may be, and really respecting that. Also, a note about consent. If consent is not something you're familiar with, I just want to highlight it quickly. It's very taken very seriously here at Western and the broader Canadian context. Consent is very important, and without consent, any sexual activity or even interaction is considered sexual assault and could come with really serious consequences. So consent is never assumed or implied. Absence of no doesn't mean that you have consent from another person. It, consent cannot be given if a victim is impaired by alcohol or drugs or is unconscious, and can never be obtained through threats or coercion. Consent can also be revoked at any time. So even if somebody allows you to kiss them one time, hug them one time, doesn't mean that then you're allowed to do that forever and always. It can be revoked at any time. And then cannot be obtained if the perpetrator abuses a position of trust, power, or authority. So if it's, for example, a TA for um, has a position of trust and authority in some cases, and and is making sexual comments or advances, and you're really not interested in it, they can't obtain consent or assume consent, but just because they are in the position of authority. So super important. Some other cultural tips, holding doors, common courtesy to hold doors open for the people behind you. I'm sure you've noticed this already. Even if they're a few meters away, if you have time, wait and hold the door open. Common courtesy. In terms of lining up, always line up and wait your turn in public places like cafes, bus stops, and stores. Again, depending on where you're coming from, it might be extremely common to just cut the line or, sneak in at the front. Here in Canada, we really respect that, lining up and taking turns. In terms of tipping at a restaurant or leaving a little bit of extra money, the norm in Canada is about 15 to 20% if you're dining out. And then for other services, for example, taking a taxi cab or getting a haircut, it might be around 10%. Taxes, sales tax in Canada, or in Ontario rather, is about 13%, and it's typically not included in the sticker price that you see at the store. So I'm sure you've noticed that already. All right. Our next section is on finding community. Again, I want to remind you, if you have any questions about that sort of Canadian culture piece, Canadian context piece, or anything that we've covered so far, definitely pop those questions into the Q&A box. No question is silly, so definitely do that as we go along. So the next section is finding community. And there are many places to meet new people and begin building your community on campus or in Canada. on campus and off campus. So on campus, obviously we're biased, so we're going to say ISC programs and events run through Western International are a great way to find community. We try to offer as many opportunities during international student orientation for you to meet new people. That was by design. And then there's always programs and events that run throughout the year with that goal in mind too. On campus, obviously, you can meet people in class. The recommendation is to sit in the same spot or the same general area every week, and you'll end up, I think, making connections with the people who also sit in that same spot or same general area. You might frequent the rec center or participate in student clubs, study groups, student spaces, special events, and then volunteering and working is also a great way to meet new people. Off campus, there's a variety of community sports leagues if you're into that, public events and special interest classes and workshops. Some are free, some are paid. There's the London Public Library groups and programs that are accessible to you as a resident in London. Cultural clubs, religious organization, and places of worship. Community centers are great hubs for meeting people and building community. Outdoor spaces, of course, and then again, volunteering or working off campus is another great way. So as I mentioned, our ISC programs, you can sign up if you haven't already to have a peer guide. So that instant friend on campus, the instant connection to Western International and to student life on campus, you can sign up anytime, even if you think you don't need a peer guide now, but in a few months, you're thinking, I might want to be connected, you can sign up anytime. English conversation program currently has a wait list for this term, but the program runs every term for 8 weeks. So if you missed it this term, you can sign up in January or May. And then Global Cafe is a weekly drop-in event. So if you haven't been to Global Cafe yet, we encourage you to attend. Every Thursday is an opportunity from 3 to 5 p.m. You don't have to stay the whole time. You can come, for half an hour or for 20 minutes. You can stay the whole time. You can come midway through. Very casual event. Really, our goal there is to have a consistent space every week where students can connect with each other and build that community. For Global Cafe, obviously, it's open to international exchange students, but also the wider Western community. So if you have a domestic student roommate or a lab mate, definitely bring them with you and tell them about it, right? There's free coffee, tea, and snacks every week. So nothing, nothing everybody doesn't love. Also, SOGS committees and grad clubs events if you're a graduate student. So if you don't already know, this week is orientation week with SOGS. So they have a number of social events. We'll pop that in the chat. Yep. Thank you, Ray. So if you missed some, I think there's still some ongoing today, tomorrow, that you want to check out if you're a grad student to meet other grad students. The Wave and Spoke often have events for students. There's a regular musician by the name of Rick Mayee. He's sort of a legend at Western. He has been playing here for a number of years, long before I came to Western. He's been playing forever and is a staple. And so people come, know his songs, learn his songs, and really enjoy that. Cronin Observatory is the observatory on campus, and they host regularly some public nights where you can learn about stars and the moon and all things. All the things that they do that you can use their telescope, their giant telescope, some of their smaller telescopes. They usually have a speaker at all their public nights on various different topics with research. So yeah, great. I brought my kids to a public night not too long ago and they loved it. So good for all ages. Western Varsity Athletics games, if you don't know, are free for all students to attend home games. So anytime Western um, Mustangs teams, whether that be football, hockey, or basketball, or whatever it is, are playing at home, it's free for students. So that's amazing. You just need your student card. So the link is there if you want to check out the schedule. Also, the Faculty of Music often has free concerts. Usually they happen on Friday afternoons. We'll put the link in there as well. So have a bunch of free events if you're into music. And then, of course, club events. So if you are participating in any of the many clubs on campus, um, they will host events throughout the year. So that's a great way to meet friends on campus. Quick note about clubs, although they are USC run and typically by undergraduate students, they most clubs are open to having graduate students join. So if you see anything on the clubs list that interests you, just email the club directly and see if you can join. So where to look for all this information? Tons will come through your Western email. I know you get a lot of Western email, but really, if you're looking for opportunities on campus, pay attention to the emails that you're getting, whether that's the International Student Network email from our office or other emails from across campus, letting you know what's happening. Of course, social media. So follow us at Western International, follow SOGS if you're a graduate student, the USC if you're an undergraduate student. Follow all those appropriate pages, and then you'll be up to date on what's happening on campus. There's also the Western events calendar. So if you go to the main site and click on the events calendar, you'll see all the events happening at Western. SOG's website, Western News, the Gazette, which is the student-run newspaper. Eventbrite also has events posted. And then, of course, as you're walking across campus, you'll probably see a variety of posters and print materials promoting events on campus as well. Quick note about the grad club. So grad students get 10% off at the grad club. So if you're interested in a meal or drink with friends, you can get 10% off as a graduate student. In terms of exploring off campus, there's lots in the city of London. I know oftentimes if you as an international student are coming from really a major city, um, abroad, or if you've lived in places like Toronto or Vancouver before, you might come to London and think, I actually have heard from students, it's such a sleepy place. There's nothing going on here. And it's not that nothing goes on here, that's really untrue. It's just that it's a little bit harder to find, or can be a little bit harder to find. But there's lots of great things going on in the city of London, lots to explore. So you just have to get curious about it and look into these opportunities. So in terms of live theater, there's a Grand Theater, Palace Theater, there's Budweiser Gardens, who big arena that does concert shows, sports games. The London Knights play there. There's a variety of museums. So Museum London, the Archaeology Museum, Children's Museum if you have children, a variety of movie theaters across the city, the public libraries. As I mentioned, there's 16 locations across the city. Each one looks a little bit different, has different offerings, so worth visiting all those that you can visit. There's the Western Fair and Casino, the market at Western Fair, Covent Garden Market downtown, also Gibraltar Trade Center. and trails and markets. If you're looking for something to do on the weekend, those are all great options. Historical landmarks, Eldon House, Banting House, Pioneer Village, all great to explore as well. Yuck Yucks for comedy, and then entertainment venues. So London is home to the largest entertainment complex in the province, called the Factory. There's Palisade, East Park. We encourage you to really look into all these places. You're not going to get to all of them in your first month or even in your first term. Just the point of this slide is to know that even if it's not kind of in your face, there's lots to explore in the city of London. Doors Open London has passed for this year. It was last weekend, but every September, there Doors Open London is an event where some of the public spaces around the city of London are free to enter and explore. All right. So when I say explore all these opportunities, I'm going to give you some useful resources at this point, some websites. Whoops. Let me go back. Oh, so the first one is london.ca. So this is the City of London's website, and if you go on their website, you'll see links to parks and facilities, recreation, as well as garbage and recycling. If you live off campus, that will be useful. But if you click on the recreation and parks and facilities, you'll learn more about, hiking trails, public parks, community centers, and the like. There's also londontourism.ca. They have great sections on their website on things to do, events in the city. They have guides, so where to eat, places to explore with your family if you have family. And then they have some videos. So if you don't want to make the trek out, for example, to a certain landmark or location, you want to know a little bit more about it, the videos can be really a great resource or a sneak peek into some of the destinations. Downtownlondon.ca is a website dedicated to promoting downtown London businesses. So there's a downtown map and downtown London trails. They often have events or discounts on their website as well. And then getting to all these places, you want to become familiar with londontransit.ca. You'll see the real-time bus info. You can follow LTC London on X, so you're the first to know about updates or short-term detours and schedule changes. So if you need some company, we recommend posting an invite on socials or via text if you're part of a group chat or WeChat group. Something like, "Hey everyone, I'm planning to explore this place or visit somewhere this weekend. Anyone want to join me?" Invite people you meet in class or through the peer guide or ECP or global cafe programs. Start small and go from there. Attend events on your own and meet people there. So even if you can't find anybody to go with you, don't let that deter you from going on your own. Keep safety in mind and just be friendly and confident. And the chances are high that you will meet somebody there. We put out a goal, a challenge to you. Make it a goal to connect with at least one new person every day or week or month, whatever goal seems reasonable to you. We know that some people are more outgoing than others. So if it is reasonable, one new person every month feels more comfortable than every day, but choose a goal and really stick to it. Be sure to follow up with new acquaintances. So you're the newcomer here, and the reality is if you're meeting somebody who already has established social networks, they might not have the same urgency as you do to, create those connections and foster them and keep up with them. So you'll need to do some of that work, more of that work at the beginning, right? So follow up with people once you exchange contact information and keep it going. Remember that deep friendships really develop over time and require consistent effort. So be sure to take that initiative. All right. I've talked for a long time, so I'm going to pass it over to Fabiana for this next section.
Thank you, Francesca. And just to follow up with what Francesca was talking about, that it takes time to make those friendships. A professor at the University of Kansas, Jeffrey Hall, did some research a few years ago, and he found his research was on university students actually. And one of the things he found was that it takes 50 hours to go from an acquaintance to making a casual friend, 90 hours to actually become friends with somebody of consistent kind of connection, and 200 and plus hours to become close friends. So just keep that in mind as you get maybe sometimes frustrated as not being able to make friends quick enough. That it does take time, and this is something I've been talking to my daughter about, who's a first year student this year, and she lives off campus. And so that frustration of not being able to make those new friends as quickly as those that are living in residence because they're living together and having those hours of interaction. And so just something to keep in mind at the back of your head as you're kind of craving for those deeper friendships. It does take time, and so inviting people out and talking to people is really important. So to talk about student life at Western, Western is great because there's so much of a student life and so many things to do on campus. So some of the places that students hang out here on campus, a big part is in UCC, where there is that central hub with the food courts and some study spaces. Many events take place in the Mustang Lounge. There is a fireplace lounge on the second floor, and many students hang out at the Spoke and the Wave on campus. Students also hang out at the libraries, so everybody is studying, and so getting a table together and studying together. Our grad students hang out at the grad club, as Francesca has mentioned. The IGAB atrium, which is our building where Global Cafe takes place. There's also study. You can also study there if there's no events happening. And right now, when the weather is so beautiful and nice, you see many students hanging outside on UC Hill, where there's all the tables and the benches and chairs to kind of hang out with some friends. For those of you who have family and small children, on campus in the Weldon Library, there is a family room. So this is a child-friendly area with tables and chairs that are tailored for children to use. There's also a study, like a quiet study space for parents while you're keeping an eye on your kids. There's also TV and outlets to keep your children entertained while you try and get some work done, right? Because balancing life as a parent and having your kids with you and your studies is important. And so to use the space, you do have to reserve it in advance. The link is down below. And your children do have to be with you in order to use the space, and your children have to be supervised at all times when you're in that space. So you can't just kind of drop them off in that space, go to class and come back and get them. You do have to always be there in the space with your children. But it is a great place where, you know, your kids can play and do their things without disturbing other students while you're trying to maybe get some stuff done at the same time. Some special occasions to keep in mind that are coming up. Homecoming, or HOCO, as many of our students call it, is this weekend actually. And it's a long-standing tradition to celebrate our Western Pride, our Purple Pride. And homecoming is usually a time when our alumni come back to campus, but many of our students like to also celebrate homecoming. And so one of the big events that happens during the weekend is the homecoming football game and the fan festival on September 28th. Really important during homecoming weekend. Please make sure to keep yourself hydrated, your phone working. Sometimes the areas get really crowded, and so you might not get good reception. So make sure that you go with a friend, you stay together, and that you stay safe and help people around you. And that you eat a good heavy meal before heading out into homecoming events. Another one is Halloween, which is on October 31st. However, some people like to celebrate fall/Halloween throughout the whole month of October. And so during Halloween, you'll see that students will have parties, and different venues on campus will have costume parties where you'll dress up with a theme, and they'll have theme events. Making sure when you're wearing a costume that you're being respectful, that you're not wearing a costume related to somebody's culture or religion. You'll also see some places doing haunted houses or corn mazes. And during Halloween night, so on October 31st, you'll see children, as soon as it gets dark on the streets, children will dress up and they will go around the houses trick or treating. So what they'll do is they'll knock on your door and they'll say trick or treat, and basically they're expecting you to give them some candy. And candy usually comes in their own sealed packages. And so if you live in a house, if your lights are on, children will ring your doorbell or knock on your door. If your lights are off, then they won't come to your house. And then we have our Christmas and holiday season, which is Christmas falls on December 25th, but the holiday season begins with on November 11th with Remembrance Day and ends on January 2nd after New Year's Day. And so during the season, you'll see people will decorate their houses with lights. At Victoria Park, there'll be a special event where they light the trees up. There are Meet Santa days. And the other thing that's unique to Canada is that November 26th is Boxing Day. So this is a day when things go on sale. So I'm sure many of you have heard about Black Friday in the United States, which Canada also has. Boxing Day is kind of the equivalent to that in Canada. I do also want to highlight two other holidays or events happening in the fall term. One is Thanksgiving, which happens at the beginning of October. This is a time where families typically will get together and they'll have turkey and potatoes and different meals together, and just give thanks for the harvest and kind of for all that they have in their lives. So this is a time for those of you that are living in residence. Many of the students you'll see will be heading home during that weekend, and this year it is also tied to your reading week. The other important date is on Monday is the National Day of Truth and Reconciliation, where it's a time, so there's no classes that day, and it's just a time to learn and reflect about Canada's history around the residential school system for the Indigenous peoples in Canada. So it was a very dark time in Canada, where children were taken away from their families and their language and their culture was lost. And so I encourage you to take the time to learn. The Office of Indigenous Initiatives at Western has lots of great resources. So please take some time and learn about this part of Canada's history. As many of you plan to settle here in Canada, this is an important part of Canada's history that you learn and that you're aware of and that you're respectful about. Planning for university breaks. So there are some times when you'll have time off from school. Two of them are your reading weeks. This is in particular for our undergraduate students. Graduate students, sometimes you are given these reading weeks and sometimes you're not. So it's important to check in with your academic program. But the reading weeks this year fall October 12th to the 20th and February 15th to the 23rd. So there's no classes during this time. And then our winter break will go from December 22nd to January 6th. So there's no classes, and actually the university shuts down. So all of the offices are closed during the winter break. So a lot of the times during these breaks, many students like to travel around. So Many students will go back home, but many students will travel around in Ontario or in Canada. So whether they go to Niagara Falls or Toronto, Stratford is a small town that has the Stratford Theatre. Some students like to go to Ottawa. Some students really like to try camping and hiking, and so they'll visit some of the provincial parks or the ski hills once it starts snowing. So there are lots of different places. Some students who have a US visa will travel down to the US. So many different places to explore. Just be mindful of holidays that may fall during those break periods and places being closed. So for example, during Thanksgiving, on the Thanksgiving Monday, everything is closed. And so some of those holidays will affect access to some of the campus buildings, as well as business hours and service closures. If you live in residence, for example, during those breaks, not all cafeterias will be open. And so just make sure to check in with your residents what will be open. And look out for sometimes there are some special events happening during those breaks as well. Living with others. So many of you, most of you probably have roommates. And so some important things to keep in mind to make sure that you have a respectful and happy living space along with your roommates. So important to keep smells under control and that you're following the guidelines for sorting garbage, recycling, and composting. So this might be new for some of you, others you might be very well used to this. And so making sure that you're following those guidelines. Don't let your dirty laundry pile up. Be mindful of the smells in the kitchens and the bathrooms. So using fans and candles. If you're cooking meals with very strong smells, opening up the windows for a little bit, but don't let the heat go out for too long, but maybe turn on some candles and avoid using strong smelling cleaning products and sprays. Some laundry room etiquette. Don't leave your laundry sitting there for long periods of time because other people want to use the washing machine or the dryers. Make sure that you clean the lint trap after using the dryer. If you don't know how to do this, ask. But the reason why this is really important is because it can be a fire hazard. So it is important to clean the lint trap after each use. And don't use too much detergent. It can damage the machines. A lot of the detergent nowadays is very concentrated. So make sure to follow the instructions for that. When you're taking showers, and if you have a shower curtain, making sure that the shower curtain is fully inside the bathtub when showering, and check for any gaps that might let water escape. So in some countries, for example, sometimes the bathroom is like a wet bathroom where everything can get wet. Here in Canada, because of the way the houses are made, there's no drains in the bathrooms like on the floors. And so it's really important to make sure that you don't get the floors wet because that can damage the floor, it can cause mold and lots of other issues. So being mindful of that as you're using the showers. And if you have shared facilities, making sure you're respectful, that you clean up after yourself and that you leave shared spaces tidy, that you wash your dishes, for example, after using them, not leaving things lying around, not leaving personal items in shared areas for an extended period. So just being respectful of the space around you. One of the really great resources is the off-campus housing website where you can find information about renting in London and the city bylaws. So there are specific rules in London, for example, as to the noise levels and how late you can be loud. Lots of great resources about renting and kind of getting along with roommates. If you live in residence, the residence website has information about your contract as well as a guide for international students with lots of really helpful tips and information there for you. But, you know, sometimes conflicts may arise with your roommates and it can be challenging, right? You're used to living in different ways. You might come from different cultures, different values, different ways of doing and being. And so if you don't talk about those things, those conflicts can really get out of hand sometimes. And so really important as things are still new and you're figuring things out, It's strongly recommended that you create a roommate agreement, outlining what are those responsibilities? Who's responsible for what and when? And what are those expectations? How will you deal with paying for the bills? Who's taking out the garbage? The space in the refrigerator, right? All of those different things, coming into an agreement with your roommates so that you all know what to expect and that you're not assuming things, right? Based on how you think it would be done back home. Really important to communicate and address issues calmly and directly. Don't be passive aggressive, leaving little sticky notes somewhere, saying something. Just sit down and talk as roommates together. Say, hey, I'm noticing this. How can we address it? This is how I'm used to doing it. How are you used to doing it? And try to come to an agreement kind of in the middle. But if things are getting out of hand, you can seek help from resident staff or off campus housing mediators. Usually in residence, they will try and get you to deal with the conflict directly with your roommate and have you try and resolve it initially yourselves. And if not, the resident staff will come in and help you have those conversations together. If you are in residence, there is also a residence counseling team. So if you feel that you need to talk to somebody, they are there for personal, academic, and emotional support. They also plan different workshops and provide crisis support for students who need that urgent mental health support. And so this is in addition to the counseling services available in Timms Hall through Student Health Services. Next, we're going to talk about taking care of your finances. Living in Canada can be quite expensive, so making sure that you are taking care of those finances. So if you've already set up your bank account in Canada, you would have a bank card. Some of you may not have a bank account here and you're wanting to use your bank card from back home. So just make sure it has the plus, Ceres, or Maestro symbols on the back of the card. And usually you can use that as a debit card here, at least within the ATM machines. But just be aware of those transaction fees for each withdrawal. Usually here, the ATM machine will charge you a fee and your bank may charge you a fee as well, plus the fees for the currency conversion. So it can get quite expensive very quickly. If you are still looking to open a bank in Canada, some things to consider is to think about, is the bank connected to your home banks? Is it easy to transfer money from your home bank to that bank here in Canada? Does the bank offer student rates and what do they offer in those student plans? So most banks do offer a student plan. Usually the banking, they take away the bank fees. Sometimes they give you more transactions. So really important to compare the different banks and what they offer for students. The one thing to remember if you get a student rate is that every year you have to go into the bank and show proof that you are still a student. So to open a bank account here in Canada, you need 2 forms of ID, including your passport and student card. And the other thing to know is that here in Canada, doing e-transfers is really common. It's done directly through your bank account, and it's a very common and safe way of sending money. So a lot of the times you do that through for paying your rent, or if you're sharing bills with somebody, you easily transfer money that way. So there's no external apps to do the e-transfers like there are in some other countries. It's done all directly through your own banking, your bank here in Canada. And just be cautious of any unexpected e-transfers or messages that you're receiving. So if you're not expecting it, just be careful because it could be a scam. And that's the list of some of the banks near the university. So basically, most of the banks can be found close to the university campus, and most of them have a bank machine right on campus. Many of them are in the UCC. The other piece is making sure to set a budget. For some of you, this might be your first time away from home. Maybe your parents gave you the money for the next 4 months or maybe the next year. And so learning to manage that and set a budget. So on the screen, you'll find a bit of a sample budget of the approximate expenses per month of how much maybe rent is, how much to spend on food, your utilities and your cable, your internet, your phone, personal expenses, your clothing, eating out, your laundry, your books. So really important to sit down. If this is your first time being away from home, maybe sitting down with your parents and setting out what that budget is and keeping track of your expenses, and adjusting as you need to throughout the month so that at the end of the academic year, you're not left out of money. And so you will likely spend more money in your first month or two, as you've probably realized already. So don't panic. A lot of those costs are one-time costs, right? So your books that you had to buy, if you're living off campus, you had to pay a rent deposit and deposit for your utilities, buying furniture. So again, in the beginning, you spend a little bit more money, and then you start to even out that budget and what your monthly expenses will be. As Francesca has already mentioned, taxes is 30% in addition to that ticket price. So as you are going out, always kind of keep that in the back of your mind of budgeting and planning how much you're going to spend in that shopping trip. Some tips is to plan for unexpected costs and future needs, such as winter clothing, right? And so making sure that you do keep aside some money, a little savings on the side for those unexpected expenses or those future expenses that you know will be coming. Explore things like scholarships and part-time jobs if you are allowed to work here in Canada, and take advantage of any store discounts or offers by showing your student card. So sometimes there are student deals, or you can get a card that has student deals and discounts, looking for coupons online. So making sure that you're looking for those ways. Some grocery stores, for example, have special days where they give students a discount. And so taking advantage of that as much as possible. With clothing, for example, winter clothing, many of you will start purchasing that. Just know that those things will go on sale. So don't buy your winter jacket and your boots at full price. Make sure to wait until the sales begin. And track those monthly expenses, whether it's a spreadsheet or on your tablet or your computer, just to make sure that you are staying within your budget. With regards to financial support for undergraduate students, Western does have the work study program, which is you can apply for it after you've been in Canada for a year. And the applications always open up in September and at the end of April of every year. So that allows you access to some of the on-campus jobs. It is a need-based program. We do have the International Student Emergency Bursary, which supports students in an unforeseen or emergency situation where something is out of your control. There are some scholarships through Western and through external parties that international students may be eligible for. And then we also have the International Student Emergency Loan of up to $500. This is a short-term loan for students, again, facing that unforeseen financial emergency that helps you in paying things like a medical bill or a fund transfer delay or essential academic materials. If you think that you will be late in making your tuition payment, it's extremely important that you contact Student Financial Services as soon as possible. Communicate with them, create a plan with them, as far as making sure that eventually your tuition does get paid. Otherwise, your records will be sealed. And that means that you won't be able to register for classes or get any of the letters that you may need. For graduate students, very similar to the undergrads, there are some financial programs and loans through SOGS, which is your student union. So they do have some bursaries, emergency loans, and subsidies, including a subsidy for your UHIP fees, for example. If you're a TA, you are part of a union, which is the PSAC Local 610, and they also have some additional financial assistance for unexpected financial needs. There are Some scholarships available again through Western or external parties. Most of the scholarships through Western are for students in research based programs. And then also the emergency student loan, which I mentioned in the previous slide. Again, the note around if you think you might be late with tuition payments, making sure you are in contact with Student Financial Services as soon as possible. For those of you that are looking to work in Canada, we have lots of supports here at Western. One of the great services is our careers and experience team. So making sure they have a lot of information on their website. They offer workshops throughout the year, and they also have career coaches that you can meet with one-on-one. And one of the career coaches focuses on international students and has drop-in hours in our office every other week on Thursdays from 2 to 4. So you can come by our office and get that one-on-one help with them. But they can give you feedback on your resume and cover letters, do practice interviews, which they call mock interviews. And so making use of that service right from the beginning, right? And preparing for life after graduation as well. If your study permit allows you to work while you're here in Canada right now, you may work up to 20 hours a week off campus and unlimited hours on campus. So there's no restriction to the on campus hours as long as you're enrolled as a full time student. Um, Currently, the hours are set at 20 hours a week off campus. They are expected to increase to 24 hours, but they haven't increased just yet. And this isn't an average, it's a maximum of 20 hours a week off campus. So if you do have any questions about the immigration rules, you can book an appointment with one of our international student advisors and we can go over the rules with you and make sure that you are eligible to work. In order to work in Canada and to be paid, you also need what's called a social insurance number. And you also need it for if you're receiving like a scholarship or a bursary. And so you would apply for that through the Service Canada office or online. And you do need to have your study permit and passport when you apply. Make sure that you protect your SIN number. It is a personal piece of information. Don't carry it with you and don't share it unless it is required by law. Taxes. Most international students that are here are likely considered residents for tax purposes, but not always. And so it's important to figure that piece out first. But if you are considered a resident for tax purposes, you might be eligible for some benefits and some refunds, even if you don't earn any income. And so it's really important to file your tax return if you plan to stay in Canada long term. And so to file a tax return, the deadline is always April 30th, and it's based on the previous calendar year's income. If you do have any sort of employment income, scholarships, bursaries, research grants while you're here in Canada, you are required to file a tax return. And in Canada, you do have to report your world income. So it doesn't matter if the income is not from Canada, you do have to still declare it here in Canada and you are taxed on it. So we do have different supports and resources come tax time. So starting in February, March, you'll notice that there will be a campus tax clinic and community resources where volunteers can help you with filing your taxes. And every year our office does some information sessions during the month of March and April to get you started with doing taxes and figure out what you need, what documents, how to do it. And so make sure to just keep an eye out for that in the winter term. If you have any questions, the best place to start is start with Western International, start with our office. We offer that wraparound support. A lot of what we do is immigration advising, but we do support students with settling in and making sure that you are thriving and succeeding here at Western. And so whether that is helping you form personal connections, taking care of your personal well-being, looking at career development and where you can gain some of those skills, connecting you with the community and gaining some more skills while your time here at Western. And so you can book an appointment with our international student advisors. We're also here if you just need someone to talk to. Maybe you're feeling homesick, or maybe something's going on back home and you don't know what to do, or you have those immigration questions. So we do have in person and virtual services. Our drop in hours are every Monday to Friday from 1 to 4 in person, and we have our online appointments that you can book through our website. As Francesca has talked about, we have our Peer Guide program, so I won't go into detail again because I know she has talked about it, as well as our English conversation program. So if you haven't signed up, I encourage you to take the opportunity right now to sign up for either program. Again, the English conversation program does have a wait list, but if you are interested, I would encourage you to sign up for that wait list. And really important to make friends, have fun, and get involved. So whether that is coming out to Global Cafe, attending some of our events, coming out to our family tea and information session, volunteering with us, and making sure that you're checking our weekly network email, where we will send out information about what's coming up in the next week and important information that's relevant to international students. So I will pass it on to Francesca to wrap things up.
Thanks, Fabiana. I know that was a lot of information. We covered a lot of ground in this webinar, being our last one. So we appreciate you staying until the end.